I think this notion of, culturally and linguistically responsive RTI or MTSS gives us permission to not the idea of when do we test, but this notion of when do we support and how do we support and how do we assess early on. So this notion of really enriching what's called like tier one, so the classroom environment. How do we enrich that environment, make it more culturally linguistically responsive, use ESL, bilingual pedagogy in the classroom, so that most of the needs of most English language learners' needs will be met there. But then there are a small percentage of children who will need other support. So then again, proactively you can have small group instruction that's ELL appropriate in the classroom, but targeting those students who are having a little bit more challenge than other students. You're still not in special education, but you're providing student support. And this process is really fluid because they may have what they need so that they don't even need the small group instruction anymore. They have the resources and the situation was resolved. But then there are other students, and there are a handful of students, maybe 3 to 5% of students, that even with a rich learning environment in their classroom, even with small group instruction, even with sort of one-on-one or very small group instruction and support, those students may still not make the progress that you would expect compared to their like peers. And so it's of those students that you then can go on to further assessment and explore if it is in fact maybe not just English language learning needs, where you want to continue to support them, but additionally they may also have special education needs. But what this allows us to do is we don't, again, wait for them to have to fail or to have such difficulties that it's very difficult. The question is, when do we support? When do we intervene and support? Well, as soon as or before there are difficulties, right? So that's that notion. I'm describing like 3 tiers of support, but there are systems in the United States where it's like 7 tiers of support, right? And the process is, how to make the whole system more culturally linguistically responsive. And so I worry when it's this notion of waiting. While we don't want to over-identify students like immediately that they're having challenges, we go to special education. But I worry about students who have challenges, who have anxiety, who have language expressive difficulties, who have reading difficulties, who have these intrinsic difficulties, and we need to support them early on and in a way that is culturally linguistically appropriate for them as early as possible. But I think this, if RTI and MTSS is done in a culturally linguistically responsive way, you can support those students early on, and then I think find the kids who are also have special education needs a lot sooner, I think.
Becky Bueno says, would like to learn more about linguistically responsive RTIs, so she is right on the same page. And Katie Myers says, we use an RTI approach before developing an IEP. What strategies would you suggest? So I think both of those comments kind of highlight, this, in the maybe in the ideal scenario, what does that look like, the culturally and linguistically responsive RTI?
Well, there are a couple of things. I mean, that's sort of what we describe in the book, but my colleague Lori Donnell and I were able to do a guide, culturally and linguistically appropriate RTI squared. We did a project for the WIDA consortium, and you can just go on the WIDA.us website. It's a free downloadable kind of guide, and it has a place for information gathering. It also has questions to ask along different factors. So that's available free of charge. You can use that with your teams, and it's kind of a guide so that we have questions that we can ask during problem solving when we're having, the children are having challenges, but also a culturally linguistically responsive learning environment. It's huge, it's honoring students' languages in multi-languages. It's affirming their identity as bilingual, multilingual, multicultural beings. It's using pedagogy that makes content comprehensible and meaningful while also teaching language, academic language, in a consistent, sort of articulated way throughout their schooling. It's bringing in their cultural and linguistic resources from home so that the students see themselves reflected in the curriculum, and they also learn about how other people live. It's building on their strengths. I think that's a really very big piece, and I really, my colleague Teresa and I are very inspired by the work that's being done at the University of Pennsylvania and other places on positive psychology and the focus on strengths and building students' strengths, all of our strengths, identifying them and using them. It's a really different approach because oftentimes we focus on student deficit, but really helping students find what their strengths are, as well as the family, and then when in instruction and intervention and assessment, and then when things are maybe becoming challenging, use those strengths to help them work on those things that are difficult for them. It's a culturally linguistically responsive learning environment has meaningful curriculum and instruction that's connected, and they don't learn things sort of in a reductionist way, but in a meaningful context. So all of these things that are really important and essential for English language learners, I think, make an entire system more culturally and linguistically responsive for all our students. Nancy Cummins from Colorado, University of Colorado in Boulder, I believe. Sorry, Nancy. So Nancy Cummins, her work with her colleagues on sort of designing schools with diversity in mind to begin with is just brilliant work. It really is. It's starting from the beginning to create these learning environments that are responsive to the diversity in the community that you serve, but it ends up being a rich environment for all the students. So Nancy may be in Finland right now, but because she does work there quite a bit, and but very inspiring her work with her colleagues on just that. So there are a few resources there that might help our participants today.
That's great, and when we go through our archive of this, we will make sure to put links to all of these different resources as well. And I think that's again another example of what's good for ELLs is good for everybody, even at a system-wide, school-wide level. So let's see. Rosa Maria says this is a very important topic, often confused as a second language barrier, and the LD is not identified on time. Let's see. Ashley is looking for practical strategies for monolingual special education teachers who are working with students in a bilingual setting.
Oh, so they're doing inclusion then. So I'm assuming the special education teacher is working in the bilingual classroom to support the students. Is that?
Or if not in a bilingual classroom, at least in a bilingual school where maybe the teacher, I'm assuming, is an English speaker, but working within a bilingual program model.
Yeah, really going back to that collaborative piece, this is very important. The work that's been done on there's research that my colleague and I have been looking at, and it's very interesting because this collaborative piece is so essential. It's not even just like a touchy-feely, feely good, to be working together. It's essential that we collaborate because, again, we have different expertise, and so we don't. But the student is sort of in the middle, right? So in that sort of interface, right? They are English language learners or bilingual learners with special education needs, and then we have two professionals who have different expertise. So what's very interesting is even if we're serving the student in these two different settings, or we're fulfilling our minutes and our obligation, unless these two professionals, or the bilingual educator and the special educator, unless they talk to coordinate and make that day cohesive to the student, the bilingual learner with special education needs, their needs will not be met. So we may, on paper, it looks like we're programming appropriately, but just having the conversation and like, what are you working on? What are you working on? Oh, so you have a unit on the solar system. Okay, I'm going to do the therapy or the work that I'm doing. I'm going to use the solar system, maybe it's vocabulary that they're working on or whatever. I'm going to make sure that it's tightly connected to what you're doing in the classroom. And so that becomes, even if it is in English, using, you know, ESL pedagogy, making sure they're visuals and all those things. But so then when the student is learning something in this setting, it directly connects when they're in the other setting. And we have made those connections for those children who are having challenges. And the other thing is, again, as a bilingual educator, our expertise is not in learning disabilities, right? We don't have the same experience and knowledge that our colleagues in special education have. They have vast, not just from their studies, vast knowledge and experience from their clinical experience, from their working with hundreds of children with special education needs. So what we need is to have a conversation so they can talk to us about how the sort of characteristics of a particular disability from their experience. And together we can talk about how the difficulty, the disability, the special education need is manifesting in the classroom. So I, as a classroom teacher, if you talk to me about this child is having maybe their difficulties is with auditory comprehension, so understanding the message, whether it's in English or Spanish or Russian, whatever their languages are, that and how that manifests and what it feels like to the student who has that difficulty. As a classroom teacher, I'm going to be able to put in place some strategies. For example, I'll know that when I pose a question, maybe everyone's doing think, pair, share, but I have to also realize that that child who has auditory comprehension difficulties, even if I'm teaching in their own language, they're going to need a little bit more time. They need time to understand the question that's been asked, to formulate the answer, to think about it, to comprehend, and then they can think about what their answer will be. So it's yes, a good practice to do, for example, think, pair, share, and to have students have that wait time, but understanding that this child has significant difficulties in that particular area is very important that you as the classroom teacher know. So that tightly really connected collaborative relationship is important because it goes two ways. We want to make sure that wherever the student is, both of their needs are being met, and that falls on the responsibility of the adults to, even if you're not co-teaching, but you're in like different situations, you may not be doing that. And even if you don't know the language, value the language and bring it in, have kids, preview things in their home language, with peers or from home, so that when you do your instruction in English, it's more comprehensible. You've given them time to think about what they might be, what they might, their answers are. But again, the collaboration benefits the student in every setting that they're in. So, yeah.
You had mentioned the student's schedule on paper, sort of looking, taking a comprehensive look at what is the student's day. Is it chopped up into lots of tiny pieces with different specialists and adults and services? When we interviewed Nathaniel Provencio a few months ago, he spoke about, we asked him about the best professional development that he had done, and he said it was taking a stopwatch and following a child for a day and seeing how much meaningful instruction the child had. In this case, it was about 15 minutes in the whole day because the kid was moving from so many different places. And so, I think that idea of saying, let's not just look at this little piece that I'm working on, but let's take a look at this child's schedule as a whole and figure out, are there some other ways that maybe we can strategically group. Also, we've worked at Mason Crest, which is a elementary school in Annandale, Virginia. They have been very creative about how they're a professional learning community, so collaboration is embedded in absolutely every element of the school. They actually use all of their adults to work with whatever children need the support. The special education teacher may actually have a reading group that includes some ELLs, some native English speakers, and some struggling readers, and some special education students, or not. And it was very hard, as you can imagine, for the specialists who were used to sort of working with their kids, or maybe taking them out and sort of having this focused time to get used to this model. But once they did, it just gave them the flexibility that all the adults were available to help whatever children needed it. And so it's a constant process of reevaluating who's working with what group. Now, clearly that has to be something that comes from every level of, because you need the support, but being really creative about saying, how can we, you know, look at the schedules and look at the time and look at what students need and to intervene.
That's brilliant. That's because there's so much expertise in our schools, and if we remain kind of in these silos, we're not taking advantage of all the expertise in the school to be able to benefit the students. I think about that. We have social workers who have so much knowledge about, you know, social and emotional well-being and wellness, that we can, obviously that social worker can't be you know, treating everyone, but if we can collaborate, we can learn from our colleagues and have that flexibility, then the entire school can be aware of those pieces. Or we have speech language pathologists who know so much about language development and how to elicit language and generate language, reading specialists. We have you know, all these colleagues in our buildings. I think that's brilliant to really leverage all those strengths to support the students in a more flexible way. That's wonderful.
Well, we were very intrigued by it as well when we were there.